The river that remembered, a story of lost histories and lingering spirits. They say the river carries memory, that its waters can remember what humans forget. I was 13 when my grandmother first told me this. We stood at the banks of the Mississippi at dusk, the sky an amber haze bleeding into lilac. The river was wide here, but calm, like a quiet witness. Its gentle murmur felt ancient, like a voice reaching back through centuries. Everything has a story, she said, her eyes reflecting the water's glow. Everything that touched this earth leaves a trace. Even if people forget. I didn't understand then. Not really. The story they didn't teach. School taught me about pilgrims and presidents. About wars overseas and kings long dead. But never much about the people who lived here first, the ones who knew this land like a heartbeat. Long before towns, before borders, before colonies, there were nations whose names carried the strength of rivers, forests, and winds. The Lakota, the Navajo, the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Apache, the Comanche, and many others. These weren't strangers in a distant past. They were people with vibrant societies, deep spiritual traditions, complex political systems, thriving trade networks, and profound philosophical worldviews. They understood the earth as kin, not property. They understood balance. They understood what it meant to belong to a place, rather than to own it. YouTube. But most of this was never written in bold on classroom walls. 2. The land before names. The oldest stories say that long ago, before skyscrapers, before farms, long before the concept of mine and yours, the land was alive with spirits that spoke through wind and fire. In those days, humans learned not to conquer the earth, but to listen. They listened to the seasons, to the wolves' lament at moonrise, to the call of the eagle and the whisper of oak leaves. To them, land was not something to be claimed. It was something to be known. A person's identity was woven into the geography. The river, the mountain, the prairie, these were part of their very being. Yet as newcomers crossed the great ocean, they brought new ideas of ownership and dominion, ideas that collided with indigenous understandings like thunder meeting lightning. Somewhere along the way, a question arose that changed everything. Who owns the earth? It was a question with no answer, yet it became a weapon, and a justification for centuries of war, displacement, and erasure. YouTube. 3. Arrival and unwanted guests. When the first European ships appeared on distant horizons, indigenous nations did not greet them as monsters. They greeted them with curiosity, because curiosity was part of who they were. But within decades, misunderstanding grew into fear. Fear grew into violence. Violence grew into forced removal. Families were uprooted. Children were taken. Laws were written that said, "This land belongs to someone else now." Tribes that had once prospered for millennia were forced on trails of tears that defied human dignity, miles of sorrow under sun and snow. An estimated thousands died along forced marches from homelands they had tended for generations. YouTube. Still, people survived. Still, some traditions endured. Because memory always persists in unlikely places, in song and dance, in food and laughter, in the quiet telling of stories by firelight. IV. Dancing with ghosts. I first felt the weight of all this history during a class field trip to an old museum. There, behind thick glass cases, were arrowheads and broken pottery once used by ancestors whose names we would never know. A guide said, "These belong to native people." But he said it without emphasis, as if those souls were merely artifacts. That night, I asked Grandma why it felt so sad. She did not answer at once. She took my hand and led me outside. "History isn't just dates and battles," she said. "It's the stories of people, real people. And people are more than objects." We stood under stars so bright it felt like the sky had been set ablaze. "Imagine," she said softly, "your great-grandparents, your whole family, living here for thousands of years. And then, suddenly, strangers arrive and say, your life does not matter as much as ours." I felt a chill. Did people forget them? Grandma looked at the river. "The river remembers," she said. "But humans forget." That night, I dreamed of tall grass whispering names I could almost understand, names like Thunderheart, Morning Star, Silver Fox, Swift Deer. I woke up with tears in my eyes, believing, somehow, that those spirits were calling me to remember. Stories of resistance. What school never taught me was that indigenous nations did not go quietly into history. There were warriors and leaders who stood bravely to defend their people. There were diplomats who spoke with eloquence and strategy. There were treaties, often broken, that were treaties in name only because powerful governments seldom honored them. There were uprisings. There were moments of fierce dignity. There were battles not for conquest but for survival. Tecumseh, meaning shooting star, rallied nations across vast lands in an effort to resist displacement and protect their ancestral territories. His dream was not just about land but about unity, standing together against forces that sought to extinguish an entire way of life. YouTube. Even when the odds seemed hopeless, people fought, not just with weapons, but through resilience, community, and culture. The stories we know and the ones we don't. If you were to walk into most classrooms today and ask about Native American history, especially after the 1800s, many teachers might draw a blank. Maybe they'll mention the Trail of Tears or Wounded Knee, but how many will speak of indigenous scientists, philosophers, artists, activists? How many will tell stories of triumph and ingenuity? YouTube. Yet for every page we do see in textbooks, there are volumes unwritten, stories whispered through generations. The story of the Haudenosaunee, whose confederacy influenced democratic principles centuries before modern governments even existed. The story of women leaders whose voices shaped diplomacy and warfare. The story of children who preserved languages when schools attempted to erase them. The story of ceremonies that celebrated life, not possession. These are stories of continuity, not disappearance. 7. When the river speaks. Years later, I returned to that same river where Grandma had spoken of memory. This time, I sat alone and listened. At first, I heard only water. But as dusk settled, the river seemed to hum with deeper sound, a quiet chorus of voices that blended sorrow and joy. I remembered what Grandma had said. The river remembers. History, true history, isn't static. It isn't confined to dust-covered books. It flows, like water, through time. It lives in our bones, in the places we walk, in the wind that bends the grass. I closed my eyes and imagined the land as it once was, forests teeming with life, nations walking freely, songs rising with the sun. And I realized something: history isn't what we were taught. It's what we choose to remember. 8. What they don't teach you, but you should know. In school, I learned that history was a list of names, dates, and battles. But real history, the kind that matters, carries lives. Here's what they don't often teach. Native Americans are not a footnote. They are living, breathing cultures that continue to thrive and evolve today. Indigenous peoples shaped this land long before colonial borders were drawn. Their languages, knowledge systems, and ecological wisdom saved lives for generations. Resistance took many forms. Some stood with weapons, some with words, some with ceremony, some by preserving their culture when no one was watching. This history is not ancient, it is ongoing. The stories continue. In community leaders, in poets, in healers, in activists, in educators rewriting school curricula to include what was once ignored. History, in the truest sense, never dies. It transforms. It flows. Like the river. Remembering together. I left the river at sunset with a new understanding. Not just of the past, but of my role in carrying it forward. When people ask me what I learned in school, I tell them. I learned what they taught. But not everything they should have. And then I listen, because every voice around me carries a piece of history. Some are loud and proud, others quiet and hesitant. But each deserves to be heard. Because remembering is not an act of chalk and ink. It is an act of connection. It is an act of respect. It is an act of truth. And rivers, though they may flow away from us, never forget.